Welcome to Capitol View on WSIU. I'm Brian Sapp. The spring session of the General Assembly is over. They took it to the wire. They ended up passing a new $55 billion budget. We'll talk about the budget highlights. And in addition to the budget, legislators sent plenty of bills to the governor's desk. And some bills didn't make it that we've been covering this session. We'll cover all that with this week's guests. Joining us are Andrew Adams, the State House and Chicago reporter for Capital News, Illinois, and Jason Piscia, the director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Gentlemen, welcome and good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let's start with the big thing in Springfield was the end of the session and the budget. Andrew, you were there, right? And how did this turn out? It was a $55 billion budget. It's the biggest one that they've passed yet. What happened in Springfield?
Yeah, so this budget is definitely an interesting budget for the state. It's about 3% more spending than last year's budget, which when you take into account inflation, I mean, that's not a much bigger budget than in years past. Now, over time, budgets increased, but this was definitely a tight budget year. Early on in the process this year, Governor Pritzker, when he proposed his version of the budget in February, said it was a year for tightening belts, and he was not wrong. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of concern about this budget, and there was even politically concerned because tight budgets are hard to vote for, and everyone wants to make sure that their district is represented, that the programs they care about are funded. They want to, getting votes for that budget can be hard. And there was actually a real concern that they might miss the deadline on May 31st over this past weekend. But they managed to get it in. They did that in part by raising about $1 billion in, what lawmakers and policy types call new revenues, a polite euphemism for tax increases. Now, those tax increases are, not necessarily tax increases that everyone will feel. They're kind of specialized this year. Some noteworthy ones include hiking the state taxes on nicotine products, like vaping and nicotine pouches that you might, hold in your mouth, and adding a new tax on sports betting, which is a huge industry in Illinois. There's a lot of money flowing through sports books right now. So there's some highlights from this year's budget. Definitely an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, and it was interesting. The governor said all along he didn't want a budget that had any broad-based tax increases, such as sales tax or income taxes. And for the most part, or actually it did, the budget does not contain any of those. But still, there's always some concern about where this new revenue is going to come from. One thing I thought was interesting, they're counting on about $250 million to come from tax payments from delinquent taxpayers. They're going to give amnesty to those people to let them pay their back taxes without any penalties. That's always interesting. Well, they're hoping for the best that these people will actually pay their taxes, but that's a rather big chunk of money to be assuming at this point. So, it'd be interesting to maybe put a little reminder in our phone calendars toward the beginning of the new year or at the end of the next fiscal year, how much of that $250 million actually did make it into the state coffers by encouraging these delinquent taxpayers to actually pay what they owe.
I was noticing that, like you said, Andrew, that they seemed hesitant to expand that spending. What were some of the places that we saw some modest growth? I saw the evidence-based funding for education grew a little bit. I saw that the teachers union in one of my email press releases that they were happy that they got what they were looking for, but they felt that there might have been some more. What were a couple places where that we saw some of this growth in spending?
Yeah, absolutely. just as a quick note on that education funding, the state funds schools through this formula, right? That
Mhm.
ostensibly, I mean, it's designed so that the schools with more need get more support from the state, but then schools that are incredibly well funded from local property taxes and other sources don't necessarily need money from the state. They get less funding from Springfield, and that formula that the state has to pay in a certain amount every year, and we got there, but that is a minimum, and it has been a minimum for the doing some quick math in my head, 8 years we've been using that formula. So groups like teachers unions, education advocates, they're always asking, or they're always saying that for a really high quality education system, we should put more money into it. So that's always a fight every year to see how that shakes out. There are a couple other places that there were increases this year. I mean, again, tight budget. I'm not going to say that anyone is walking out of Springfield happy. Definitely, the big focuses on this budget are in the cuts and in the stagnation. There's not a lot of raises in funding that are not legally required.
Mhm. Okay, all right. Well, let's move on to some of the bills. Jason, one of the bills that the governor proposed at his budget talk in February was some changes to the way pharmacy benefit managers were run. Can you talk to us a little bit about what was passed in this pharmacy and the prescription bill?
Sure. So, this is one of the bills that actually did make it over the finish line at the deadline here, and reins in sort of the power and the influence of what are called pharmacy benefit managers. These are kind of third-party companies that sort of work between pharmaceutical companies and drugstores just to negotiate the prices of specific prescriptions. There is criticism of these because some of them are very closely related to very large drugstore chains that you probably recognize names of, including CVS Pharmacy. And there's criticism that these pharmacy benefit managers will steer business, people who need prescription drugs will steer their business toward their home pharmacies instead of being more fair. This causes challenges for smaller pharmacies, mom and pop shops that are around Illinois, especially in rural areas, making prescriptions more expensive for them. So the state wanted to get a handle on this, specifically Governor Pritzker in his State of the State and budget address, as you mentioned in February, did talk about the undue influence that these pharmacy benefit managers have and wanted to rein them in. So this bill puts some extra fees in on them. It prevents them from steering business toward their own companies, and gives these smaller pharmacies, these smaller mom and pop places, more of a fighting chance to serve their customers. And that is a concern that these smaller pharmacies are remain viable in some, especially rural parts of the state. Some of these smaller, there aren't any CVSs, there aren't any Walgreens in these small towns. So these residents in these rural areas do need these smaller pharmacies to be affordable, to be available, to be accessible, in order so they can, get their drugs and stay healthy.
I've noticed that this pharmacy benefit managers has been kind of a trend or a talk around the nation, and it seemed to have some pretty broad support. Was that the case here in Illinois as well?
Yes, yeah. The bills, made it through. I think the Senate was like 56-1, and the House also maybe only had one no vote as well. So, this is one of those issues where Republicans and Democrats were able to agree and get behind it. So that's good.
Yeah, okay. That's a rare sight. There's plenty of, I think, bills that did have some bipartisan support and also some that didn't. One of the bills that did not make it, Andrew, and we're here in June, and there's been lots of reporting about Ameren and ComEd raising their rates. Energy is a big one, and you were covering that this session. I think the last time we talked about it. What happened with the energy bill? It didn't pass. Where does it stand?
For sure. Yeah, and that's really important context. Customers around Illinois are going to see increased bills. Ameren tells me that the increase in kind of their territory, which is most downstate Illinois, is about $45 a month for an average residential household, which is a significant increase. And that's due to a variety of reasons, and it really boils down to there's a lot of demand on the power grid right now, and there's not a lot of supply, which means, classic economics, that price is going to go up. Lawmakers have been in talks for months and months to try and get some kind of package to deal with this long term. They were never going to be able to, lower prices this summer. We're just going to deal with that. But, long term, they could regulate data centers, these really high demand industries that use a lot of electricity. They could incentivize storage and kind of the solar industry to make renewables a bigger part of the grid, and a variety of other things. But really down to the wire, there was among the people who were working on this, there was a common belief up until Saturday morning, maybe Saturday afternoon, hours before they adjourned for the year, that there would be this big package of energy legislation to keep those prices low over time. And then, classic Springfield, negotiations broke down. There were disagreements between, the various people involved, between labor and the companies and manufacturers and environmentalists who do a lot of negotiation over this. And negotiations broke down. Those conversations kind of eroded, and lawmakers couldn't agree on a bill. And it's not necessarily a partisan disagreement. It's really a disagreement among the interested parties, among the people who would be most affected by this.
What were some of the sticking points that stuck out to you?
So really over the course of the week, different disagreements happened. The big ticket item would have been requiring data centers, again, so imagine like a warehouse full of computers, right? Like, and those things just eat energy. It's hard to describe the impact that data centers have had on the grid, both in Illinois and nationwide. And it would have, and a version of this bill would have, put some regulations on them. And the most extreme version would have said, all right, if you want to build a data center in Illinois, you're building your own energy. You're finding a solar company or a wind company or whatever, and you're paying them to generate energy for you, so you don't have to take it off the grid, which is already struggling. But as you can imagine, the industry groups that represent trade centers were not happy about that. Economic development people were not happy about it. And very critically, labor unions were not happy about this. And for anyone who follows Springfield closely, when business and labor signed the same letter in opposition, it's really hard to overcome that.
Yeah, people coming together. So what happens next? Will this be then taken up in the fall, or where does it go from here?
I'll tell you what, the phrase lick our wounds was said to me several times over the course of this past weekend. So from here, people are kind of retreating back to their corners, reassessing what they want. And, I've heard that it's kind of not necessarily back to the drawing board, not going back to zero, but going back to the table for sure, and hashing this out over the summer. And, we could see it come up in the fall veto session. When we get there, we could see it next year. It's a little early to tell when it might come up, but we'll definitely return to, some kind of package of energy legislation.
Yeah, and you talked about labor and businesses getting together. We'll have to see what the impact is of these higher bills and the voters have to say. Jason, I wanted to move on. There were some other bills that were covered and passed having to do with justice. One of them was a new public defender's office. I was interested in that a little bit. What does that mean, and how is that going to help people who are in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, ever since the passage of the Safety Act a few years ago, as you know, part of that is the elimination of cash bail. And this, and now when there's a person who's been charged with a crime, there needs to be a decision made on the front end on whether they should be detained while they await trial. Cash bail is no longer an option, but if they're deemed some sort of a threat or a worry that if they were on the outside while they await trial, something bad could happen, a judge can rule to keep them in the county jail while this happens. This has really, as I mentioned, front loaded the amount of work that is needed by lawyers to determine, whether detention is necessary. And that has really increased the workload of the public defender. Public defenders, as you know, are lawyers that are assigned to especially low income, poor defendants who can't afford representation on their own. And historically, especially in smaller counties in Illinois, the public defender's office is underfunded, understaffed, overrun with cases on a weekly, monthly basis. So this bill that was being considered establishes sort of a statewide public defender's office, sort of an overseeing operation. Remains to be seen on like how effective it will be, but the thought is it will help direct resources, oversee resources, and get these counties that are overrun with cases, some person power to handle this increased need for representation on the front end of these cases.
Okay. And another bill that was passed was the gun storage bill. I saw, obviously, you had it was required people to store their guns if, just so that young people or people that weren't supposed to have a gun were able to get it. And then you had the questions come up from the Republican side worried about Second Amendment concerns. What does the bill do, and did they kind of figure out what it will mean? Let's go, Andrew, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this bill, very basically would require you to have your guns, long guns, short guns, any kind of firearm, stored in basically a gun safe, or in some kind of locked box that is secured by some kind of key or code or something like that. If you are around kids, so if you're home and you're not there, but your kids are still at home, you just make sure that they can't get to the gun, or an at-risk person, which is someone who has shown behavior that they would not necessarily use a gun safely. If your roommate starts talking about wanting to hurt people, that would potentially fall into that at-risk category. And a lot of the concern about this bill, there's the classic Second Amendment concerns of this is imposing a new requirement on a constitutionally protected right. Where is the line of and does this cross it? High chance that this is going to end up with a lawsuit, just like many other gun regulations in Illinois. And there are also concerns about just where are the bounds of the bill. If you have a concealed carry permit and you are taking your kid to school, you got kid one in the back seat, you got to go inside and pick up kid two, but you can't bring the gun onto school property. Can you leave it in the glove box? Which under the law, probably not. Could a kid who is on a shooting team drive themselves to practice? So just lots of edge cases that are going to have to be kind of worked out, clarified, either through a formal process like administrative rules, as the probably state police or another agency clarifies, well, this is what the law means, here's how we'll enforce it, or just public education with, once this thing gets into effect, making sure everyone knows what the new rules are. And that's going to take a little bit of post legislating negotiation to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page there.
Okay. I wanted to stick with you. Like most bill, that does sound like a bill that will have to make its way through and get figured out. I wanted to stick with you on a topic that seems, for the southern part of the state and those people outside of the collar counties, seems to be, their issue. The regional transit, the CTA, Metra, their concerns with their budget there up in Chicago. That was another big back and forth. Lots of ink was spilled if it was. And when I looked this weekend, just to kind of keep an eye on what was happening at the state, the Chicago stations covered a lot about the transit concerns. What that didn't pass, what can you kind of talk to us as they worked up towards the end and where the situation stands now?
Yeah, so, broadly, if folks are unfamiliar, the transit agencies up in Chicagoland, so suburbs and the city, there's about a $770 million annual budget gap. And that kind of goes into effect late this year, potentially early next year, but probably late this year. So that means fewer trains, fewer buses, layoffs. Not a good look for anyone around, and people rely on transit to get to work. On top of that, it's not just Chicago. Downstate transit agencies face kind of similar problems because of a requirement in state law about how much transit agencies have to pay in order to access state grants. And for a lot of downstate agencies, state grants are a significant chunk, if not the majority of their funding. So, there are issues around the state. Most of the issues, most of the attention, and kind of the most drastic cuts on the table are up in Chicagoland. But, folks around the state are looking for an answer. And over the weekend, people have been working on this for 2+ years. We've known this big cliff was coming. People have been working on it, and everyone expected, because these agencies have to make their budgets this summer, and those budgets can't rely on funding that isn't there. Everyone expected them to pass some kind of reform. A lot of fingers are being pointed about this situation, a lot of blame going around. Some kind of reform to how these transit agencies are managed and some way to fund them. But that fell apart. The closest it got over the weekend was the Senate passing a bill that mostly made up that funding difference by a statewide tax on deliveries. It would have put a $1.50 charge on every time you get an Amazon order or a Uber Eats DoorDash delivery, or you order on the Domino's app. $1.50 on everything, and people were very upset with that. And I've heard talk that companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, like that kind of company, sent a lot of lobbyists to Springfield very quickly. And not to mention, consumer advocates were worried that, this tax is disproportionate. Someone ordering a pizza is paying the same tax as someone ordering $1,000 of purses or $1,000 of, luxury goods. So there was serious concern about that. And those negotiations, kind of like the energy thing, and weirdly enough, a lot of the same people worked on both projects, fell apart in honestly a dramatic fashion in the 11th hour.
Okay. Well, we have just a minute and a half left. I think Jason might be able to squeeze in a little bit. The Supreme Court has decided to take up a case involving Congressman Mike Bost. Can you kind of give us a quick overview in the minute and a half we have left?
Sure. Mike Bost, a congressman from Southern Illinois, filed a lawsuit complaining about how Illinois and many other states, but specifically Illinois, how they handle mail-in ballots. It's been, even before your being able to mail in your vote was a more of a common thing, less of a common thing than it is now. Counties also allowed for up to 2 weeks for those mail-in ballots to sort of trickle in by U.S. mail, and they would still count as long as the piece of mail was postmarked by Election Day. Sort of in wake of the 2020 national election that Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump, and one of the Republicans and Trump's arguments was that, mail-in ballots, they're being counted late. There's something fraudulent about them. That was never proven. Nothing along those lines ever became remotely true. But still, this lawsuit was filed to sort of rein in the ability for counties to count these mail-in ballots after Election Day. The lower courts both ruled against Congressman Boss, but not on the question of whether it's okay to count mail-in ballots after Election Day. They noted that they're not sure if Congressman Boss has standing to sue on this issue because technically he wasn't hurt by the mail-in ballots because he's won all of his recent elections. He's a congressman. So that's the question that's the U.S. Supreme Court is now going to consider as well, whether Boss has standing to sue on this issue. So at this point, it doesn't look like the Supreme Court will get into the issue of whether the mail-in ballots, whether they're okay. That may come down the road, but we're going to deal with the standing question first.
Okay. Well, that's it for this week's CAPV. Sorry to cut you off. Join us next week.